Hi there and welcome to the channel, and in this video I'm going to do just what it says in the title. I will run through the 50 novels I read in 2023. I will refrain from attempting to rank them. Rather, I'll proceed chronologically. So, without further ado, let's begin. So the first novel I read was Patrick Hamilton's The Slaves of Solitude. This was the fifth novel I've read by this writer, all of which have been excellent. And what I really love about Hamilton is how deeply he draws the reader into the minds of his characters, further actually than you wish to go, given how disturbed his protagonists tend to be. And this one is no exception. It's set during World War II, and we get to experience the world through the eyes of Miss Roach, a teacher who's living in a guest house outside of London and doing battle with two of the residents, the abominable Mr. Thwaites and her treacherous friend Vicky. And Miss Roach grows steadily more paranoid as the novel progresses. It's bleak but humorous. It's also pretty disturbing, but it is above all brilliantly written, highly recommended. Second, Russell Hoban, Ridley Walker. This was the most challenging read of 2023. It's often compared with Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange because both of them feature invented languages, but Hoban's novel goes much further than Burgess did because here the reader has to learn an entirely new language, Ridley speak. That's because the novel, a sci-fi affair, is set in the distant future in a post-apocalyptic England where language has degenerated, as it were, and it's narrated by the 12-year-old Ridley, and you enter England through his language and you're taken into this amazing environment. It's really a compelling experience to read this book. Really difficult, really challenging at the start, but so rewarding. One of the best sci-fi novels you can hope to read, and a truly profound work of the imagination. Again, highly recommended. Next, Kobo Abe, Secret Rendezvous. This was excellent too, very funny. It's rather like Kafka meets J.G. Ballard with a bit of pornography thrown in. It's pretty perverted in places. It's full of weird sexual fantasies being acted out, but it is very unique and very imaginative. A seriously good read. If you're into stuff that's just bizarre, then Thomas Bernhard, a reread, Wittgenstein's Nephew. Yes, rereading this only made me more keenly aware of just how brilliantly constructed this very short novel is. Really is one of his masterpieces. In my eyes, it's a late effort by Bernhard. Then E Nesbit with two children's novels. The first of them was the best. The Enchanted Castle centers on a magic ring and the strange powers surrounding a country pile that some holidaying school children stumble into. It has quite a good development to the narrative, whereas the next one by her, Five Children and It, lacked that kind of through line. It was very episodic. It just felt like one thing after another. More, not so interesting. Then another Kobo Abe effort. This was also very challenging, The Boxman, but what it challenged above all was the reader's patience. At some point during the narrative, which we don't know who it's being narrated by, or has it even got multiple narrators, doesn't help that there's quite a few people walking around with boxes on their heads, yes, but at some point during the narrative, one of them exclaims, "I've got no idea what is going on," and as a reader, you will be nodding your head thinking, me neither. Then Knut Hamsun, Dreamers. This rather reminded me of Thomas Hardy's Under the Greenwood Tree, but it was more romantic and more magical than Hardy's novel. Highly recommended. Then the most forgettable novel of the year, Muriel Spark, Loitering with Intent. I can't remember anything at all about this. Does this ever happen to you? Please leave a comment and confirm that it's not something that only afflicts the disappointed man. But I literally can't remember the name of a single character, or how it began, or how it ended, or what happened in between for that matter. I know it was something awfully clever about a writer writing a book about a writer, writing a book, perhaps the book that you're reading, something like that. No, not happening. Then another Thomas Bernhard novel, Concrete. Yeah, this is also another favourite of mine from the Bernhard canon, his oeuvre. This one is a letter that someone's writing. I think they're called Rudolph, and they're obsessed with a composer, and they're desperately trying to finish off a book that they've actually failed to start writing about him for the last 10 years or so. And the reason they're hurrying to finish is because they know they don't have long left to live, and he has this terrible relationship with his sister. It's quite funny, and it has a rather abrupt change of direction halfway through. Yeah, an excellent Bernhard fiction. Then Walter Scott, The Heart of Midlothian. I've read quite a lot of Walter Scott, and this is right up there. Critically, it's regarded as one, if not the best of his novels. If you love Dickens and you haven't read any Walter Scott, this would be a good entry point, because it has exceptionally strong characters, and it also has quite a dose of sentimentality you don't always find in all of Scott's works. Yeah, a great read, even if it was 600 pages or so. Then J M Coetzee, Disgrace. I read this just because my PhD supervisor said I must know something about literary fiction that's being produced now. Or how long ago was this? Well, pretty much now. It's fairly contemporary compared with what I usually read. Well, I didn't enjoy it. If you like Coetzee, and a lot of people do, they want to give him the Nobel Prize. Or has he already won one? Yes, he's already won one. So what do I know? But I didn't get much out of it, actually. Then Eudora Welty, The Robber-Bridegroom. This is based on a Grimm's fairy tale, but it's transposed to the American Deep South. The main message I received from reading this was that Eudora Welty is one hell of a writer. Having just mentioned the Nobel Prize, Eudora Welty is also Nobel Prize winning material. Oh my goodness, it was absolutely superb. It was so lyrical and so funny and so assured. Yeah, it had this amazing confidence. From the first sentence, pretty much, you just feel like this person knows precisely what they're doing. You're safe in their hands. Just let them pilot you on this magical journey. Next, J.G. Ballard, The Unlimited Dream Company, a magnificent sci-fi novel. It's like a sci-fi novel written by William Blake. It's that good. It's all about a man who basically becomes a winged god and lords it over a suburb of London. I think it's Shepperton, pretty much, where Ballard resided for many decades. Wow. So many arresting images, so powerfully imagined. Actually, it bears comparison in terms of its imaginative gifts to Ridley Walker. So if you've read Russell Hobart's novel but you haven't read The Unlimited Dream Company, I would recommend checking that out. Then Haruki Murakami, Dance, Dance, Dance. I thought this was going to be so much better than it turned out to be. I pretty much guessed where it was going in terms of whodunit. There is a whodunit aspect to this. And the ending was just kind of nothing. And it was kind of masquerading as high art, but it was really just a page turner. Again, like Coetzee, he has his fans, his adherents, for whom he can do no wrong. I just don't happen to be ready to join them. Next, it was another Murakami, Sputnik Sweetheart. This made Dance, Dance, Dance look like War and Peace. This was pretty forgettable. It had a twist, which I saw coming an absolute mile off. And again, it just kind of dissolved into nothing. Then Alice Walker, Now Is the Time to Open Your Heart. Yeah, one of the most feeling novels of the year, as the title indicates. Pretty new age, pretty much into like ayahuasca ceremonies and sitting round in circles talking about all your terrible life experiences and trying to be healed. I'm not sneering at that. Actually, I was really into that part of it, but it was trying to do too much, and I think the quality of the writing was not of the highest. Then Jamaica Kincaid, Annie John, a Bildungsroman, and it does have its interesting moments. I guess the very frank portrayal of the sexual development of the title character, Anne, was notable. But what really got me down as I was reading this was how much it centered on her relationship with her mother. It just kind of went on and on and on until the point where every time the mother came into the story, every time she burst into the room or whatever came into view, I was just like, oh no, and sort of flicking forward, like, when does she disappear again? Scott Odell was next. Island of the Blue Dolphins, a recommendation from one of my students, a precocious 10-year-old at the time. He's 11 now, but this was really good and based on a true story of the last of an indigenous tribe who was marooned on her own island, effectively, because the rest of the population were moved off in a ship piloted, I think, by some religious organization, and no one quite realized that she'd been left behind. And then they went back many years later and found her again, and she'd survived for some 12 or 13, I can't remember how many years, but it is basically a real life Robinson Crusoe story. Unfortunately, she died pretty soon after she reached the American mainland, but this was just really wonderfully imagined. The feeling for nature that Scott Odell has was unmistakable. You just knew that he's been there, he's done these dives, he's been all around these islands, he knows the way they look at different times of the year. So the research part of this was just fantastically done. Then Shusaku Endo, first novel I've read by this Christian Japanese writer, Deep River. It was really good. It was really profound. It felt like a mature work compared with what you find in many novels. It was very spiritual, actually. Pretty much every character is embarked upon a quest as they head towards the Ganges. I really enjoyed these visions of India and what the trip meant to each of the characters. Yeah, I will definitely be reading more of Endo's work. It was a really profound reading experience, much more spiritual, in fact, than the Alice Walker one. Now is the time to open your heart. Yeah, much deeper, much better. Then Ryu Murakami, another Murakami with his 69. This was an absolute riot. One of the most anarchic novels I've read. It's like the young ones for people from Britain like me, or National Lampoon movies like Animal House for Americans or Canadians familiar with that. Yeah, just teenage high school rebellion, getting into sex, getting into rock and roll, and it was all just done so well. There was such a wonderful feel to the voice of the narrator, the teenager. There were just all these different aspects at war within him. He was able to kind of laugh at himself, but he's also trying desperately to appear really cool. Just took me right back to my own teenage days. Next, Luis Sepulveda, Chilean writer who was in exile for much of his life. He spent time in the Amazon with an indigenous tribe, 6 months, I believe. And this novel, The Old Man Who Read Love Stories, is definitely one of my discoveries of the year. I love being in the jungle. That may sound strange coming from an Englishman, but I lived in Central America for 5 years in Guatemala, and I actually lived on the fringes of the jungle, being woken each morning by the howler monkeys, how the lizards running around my house, mango tree in the yard. I just love jungles, and this one was just brilliant. I love learning about indigenous people, but anthropological works, of which I have many here in my book room, are so dry. This novel was anything but. You could feel the beating heart of Sepulveda, a man just bursting with humanity, and all the details of life in the jungle were just fascinating. Definitely one of the best books I've read this year. Strongly recommended. Then Dorothea Tanning, the surrealist artist, with her Chasm, a weekend, a very feminist work. It was really superb, actually. What I really loved is that all the middle-aged or youthful characters, shall we say, people in their 20s, just entering the workplace or trying to make a career for themselves, they were all really hollow, and they did inhabit this environment where they all kind of needed one another to get on in life, but they were effectively kind of climbing over one another. They were just so ambitious and ready to climb the greasy pole. But people at the ends of their lives or at the beginning of their lives have this self-sufficient aspect, and so the way it presented the world of this young girl was really beautiful. And similarly, the grandmother had accumulated this kind of heavy magical aura, which I also responded to, and it's the girl and the grandmother who survive the tale while the guests kind of destroy themselves. It really is a great book, something completely different to what you'll usually find, as you'd expect, from a noted surrealist. Next, another surrealist, Unica Zurn, Dark Spring. I don't believe this short work is that well known, which is a real shame. I'm not sure whether to class it as fiction or straight autobiography. Its power comes from how direct it is. Every word rings true. I really enjoyed this, even though nothing much seems to happen. It centers on an adolescent girl and her crush on a boy she sees regularly at the public swimming baths, and the way this story ends mirrors the way Unica Zurn's own life sadly ended. Highly recommended. Then Marguerite Yourcenar, Coup de Grace. This was the most powerfully written novel I read in 2023. It had the force of tragedy, centers on a love triangle between three Russian aristocrats, two of whom are siblings, brother and sister, and the other is a male, and he is the last man standing, and tells a tale that takes us into some of the most bleak zones of human experience. A really powerful read, as I say. Reminded me of D.H. Lawrence in some respects, but technically it was way ahead of him. It was brilliantly organised. I will definitely be reading more of her in 2024. Then Gunter Grass, another Nobel laureate, churning out a book that I didn't really understand the point of. In Cat and Mouse, basically, boys swim out to a rusted ship in a harbour where they compare the size of their penises and masturbate. And that's pretty much it for 150 odd pages. Then Gothic novels, William Godwin, Caleb Williams. This was absolutely superb. A man is basically pursued all across Britain by his angry master, whose secret he has discovered. So in effect, the whole of the island of Albion becomes a prison, and Caleb has to resort to living in disguises, which he frequently has to change. And his master is very powerful and is able to send out all of these leaflets offering a huge reward for Caleb's capture. So he's constantly on the run throughout the novel. It was absolutely brilliant. I think it was one of the most exciting things I read this year, told in the first person, an absolutely magnificent achievement by the father of Mary Shelley, perhaps even surpassing her Frankenstein. Then Charles Brockton Brown, Edgar Huntley, or Memoirs of a Sleepwalker. This is generally regarded as the first Gothic novel set largely on the North American continent. It's really bizarre seeing the Gothic mixed with kind of cowboys and Indians, but for all that, it was extremely satisfying, very rich in terms of the development of its plot, and just quite strange, like nothing else I'd ever really quite read. Then Mary Elizabeth Braddon, Lady Audley's Secret, a sensation novel, kind of watered down Gothic actually. And I suppose the main interest in this is this a proto-feminist novel? Because actually the villain is supposed to be Lady Audley, but I found the man pursuing her to be more despicable in many ways. Why couldn't he just let sleeping dogs lie? I don't really see that Lady Audley had done much wrong. Next, Matthew Lewis, The Monk. Difficult to know where to put this in terms of the Gothic novels I've read. It may well go at the top. This was absolutely brilliant. It was so lurid. It was like William Shakespeare wrote a novel That's what it felt like. It used all the techniques of the novelist, but it had this real medieval flavour. Absolutely superb, with amazing villains, yes, and some great ghost stories mixed in there. A must read for anyone into Gothic fiction. Then James Hogg, The Confessions of a Justified Sinner. I'd tried to start and finish this novel many times, but never quite really got going. But this time I finally finished it, and it does have one of the most exciting conclusions to any Gothic fiction that you'll read. It's just magnificent. So much kind of evil has congregated around the person of the protagonist. I can't remember his name offhand, but it gets to the point where he can't even sleep in a house with other people because there are all these paranormal disturbances, all this diabolical stuff just circulating around him. And then the way the story is framed at the end is also really satisfying. Next, Walter Scott, Guy Mannering, also a Gothic novel. This had amazing characters, and I enjoyed this one really from start to finish. If you've never read any Walter Scott, Guy Mannering would be an excellent place to begin, certainly better than Waverley in my eyes. Then another Walter Scott, The Antiquary. This was good. You have to bear in mind that the central character is a pedant, and Scott does like to use pedantic characters in many of his novels because it gives him a chance to show off all of his vast knowledge. And he said this novel was his favourite. I found it tough going in places, but it did have some really exciting scenes. It did have quite a lot of humour as well. Next is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, short novel set in Paris, published in the 50s. It was his second novel, and it has some really weighty themes because there are two dramatic events in this story. Firstly, the murder of a cafe owner, and then the execution of the man who committed the murder. And this is the titular Giovanni, an Italian waiter that David, an American, has had an affair with and then broken off. There is one really good scene in the bar when David is kind of winning Giovanni for himself from these older, jealous, wealthy gay men. Yeah, that sequence had something of life about it, but for the rest, it's really a period piece now. If you really want to read about gay life in Paris, I suggest Jean Genet, Our Lady of the Flowers. Next, Tutsi Dangaremga, Nervous Conditions. This was the first novel published in English by a black Zimbabwean woman, or I guess it was Rhodesia then. And like a lot of these novels, it can't really break much new ground. Instead, what it does is lay the foundation for Dangaremga's career. I did enjoy parts of this. It's rather uneven. It was rather front-loaded. All the best stuff was at the beginning, but I'd definitely like to see what she did later in her writing. Then Patrick Modiano, Via Triste. I think this man has also won a Nobel Prize for Literature, and again, this was really pretty awful. It was all about tone, and this extended to all of the cultural references. This book had been very carefully curated so that every reference to an album or a piece of music or a book or even a building was all on point. It was all desperately cool and sophisticated. I got nothing at all from it. Then Walter Scott, The Black Dwarf. This has such a neat plot, like a major plot and a subplot, that it works pretty much like a stage drama, and it even reminded me of Shakespeare in places. Something of a yarn, rather deflationary Gothic in the tradition of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Very good. I would say this could serve as a way into Walter Scott, but it's not representative enough of his other novels, perhaps, so Guy Mannering still remains my choice there. Then a Russian sci-fi novel, Victor Pelevin, Amon-Ra, a vicious, brutal satire of the Soviet Union via its space program, but at the same time, it was so pure in the way it depicted the dreams of teenage boys, and the real sadness, the melancholy in this book comes from how callously the state betrays the dreams of these teenage boys and lures them in and then just tears off the mask. It's too late by then. There's some really awful stuff that happens in this. It's also darkly amusing, as you'd demand really from a satire. That was a good discovery this year. Next, a children's book. Patrick Ness, A Monster Calls. A boy is having a nightmare. He wakes up, opens the windows, and there is a huge tree that he didn't expect outside with a face and a mouth talking to him, and really things progress from there. If you can suspend your disbelief and have a talking tree and a boy having a friendship, then you can go on. It's a wonderful parable, actually. All is revealed in the end, and the monster does have a very specific and rather beautiful purpose. Then a Spanish writer in Spanish from Argentina, Samantha Schweblin. I read this in the original, Distancia a Rescate, like rescue distance, I suppose. But in English, it was titled Fever Dream, and it was made into a Netflix series too. It plunges the reader straight into a life or death situation right from the get-go, and the tension and the suspense just keeps being cranked up. I was reading it just desperate to reach that point in the narrative where all would be revealed. It doesn't actually really work out that way. Your expectations are rather frustrated, and the ending is very open, but oh my goodness, what a roller coaster ride. Highly recommended once again. Then Rebecca Stead, another children's novel, When You Reach Me, set in New York City. What I liked about this is there are so many quirky characters, and you get all of their interrelations being depicted very well, and it's quite amusing too. It's got this kind of dry sense of humour, and it's got a time travel aspect to it. Strongly recommended for children. Next, Margaret Atwood, Oryx and Crag, or Oryx and Craig, or Oryx and Craig. I'm not sure how you pronounce these names. I did not enjoy this. Rather like Murakami, it was at heart a page turner, but it's kind of dressed up as art. I didn't believe this had any literary merit whatsoever. There was something monotonous, relentless about the beat of Atwood's prose, and also the supposedly funny names that she gave to products were not really funny at all. And yes, also she didn't really seem to have much grasp of character, although we're so close to, who is it? It's Oryx, I believe, is the protagonist, and you're with him all the way through. I still felt nothing at all for him. It didn't really seem credible. It was all observation rather than anything coming from the center of this character. And also, this book had way too many details. It was full. It took so long for me to process. There must have been 50,000 details for you to absorb as you made your way through this text. No. Next, Juan Rulfo, Pedro Paramo, widely regarded as the first magic realism novel, magical realist novel, or magic realism. Not sure how I should say that really, but a Mexican writer, his only novel, he was primarily a poet, but this novel is pure poetry. I read it in Spanish and also a pretty clunky English translation. It's about a man who goes back to the hometown of his mother and father after his mother's death, and he sees the village literally through her eyes, and you sort of work out as you go on that you're encountering ghosts, and the narrative is kind of sliding from one perspective to another. It's really beautifully done. Every line was like a poem, so this is what I may review in due course. Then Marguerite Duras, Moderato Cantabile. This was excellent, so tightly structured. I really did respond to this. She's one of my favorite writers now, one of this year's discoveries, and this was the second of her novels I read after The Lover, and it's set over the course of 1 week, and it's about a middle-aged woman whose having this platonic affair with a bit of rough, I guess we would call him, on the other side of town by the docks. It's just so well structured. Yeah, it was perfectly composed, like a piece of music. Then 2 more novels by Duras. The Square, which I read in a terrible Grove Press translation. The very first sentence was just nothing like what it should be. If you look at the original, and it had changed the last sentence of a novel. So it had a completely different meaning that it sent you off with. So no, the translation was a failure, but better was this one, Summer Rain, a very strange story about a very unusual family, poor, but 2 members of the family of this group of children are very, very special. I can't say any more without spoiling it, but it was short and it was also very, very beautiful. Then Walter Scott Waverley, his first novel published anonymously to great public acclaim. Yes, it has an unpolished feel to it, but it does feature one amazing character, Fergus McIver, the cunning Highlander. And I loved all of the aspects of Highland life that it delved into, which is also a feature later of Rob Roy. However, Waverley himself was rather dull, and I can't imagine that I would ever wish to reread this Walter Scott novel, whereas many of his others I've read 2 or 3 times. Where are we? Almost the end. Erskine Childers, The Riddle of the Sands. I'm just finishing up with this. It was recommended to me by one of the commenters, and I have to say thank you. What an amazing read. I am terrified of going on boats, and actually I've been on a few boats through necessity, and I became famous in one Guatemalan village because I turned a boat around midway across a lake by basically promising the captain a huge payout, and all of the other passengers, not protesters, kind of foreshadowed where I'm going with this, all of the other passengers immediately began launching these protests, but none of them was as wealthy as me, so the captain did as he was bid and returned me to terra firma. But get back to the point, all of the nautical stuff, this ocean journey, yeah, this is the way I like to travel by sea, is through a book, and this is really so suspenseful. Truly enjoying it. I have to go and get the last book, number 50, because I haven't read it yet, but there is a point for this. It's over here. This is book 50 for 2023. I believe I can finish it just in time. I've got 2 days left, and it was a gift from one of my students. Thank you, Sean and Kate. Thank you to your parents for doing this for me. And it is, they bought me a contemporary novel because they were worried if they bought anything, that was in my zone, I was almost guaranteed to have it or have read it. And so it is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Dora. And it is also a Netflix, it says on the front, and a New York Times bestseller. It's set in World War II, so it could be interesting. If you know anything about it, maybe you've read it, you can tell me if it was great or not. But I'll certainly be giving that a try in the next few days. So there we have it. I'm done for 2023. What a year it's been. I hope it was good for you. I hope you've enjoyed watching my videos. And a huge thank you to everyone who's liked, commented, and subscribed. Before I leave, I should also say, if you've read any amazing books during 2023, why not leave their titles in the comments? My reading plans for 2024 right now are wide open. So I would love to have some suggestions to carry me into the new year. But for now, all that remains is for me to bid you farewell for the final time this year in customary fashion. Be safe, be strong, and I shall see you anon. Nanu nanu.